In this talk, I'm just going to trace an analogy on the project. So there's lots of different. When you start thinking about it's quite explosive. There's lots of really interesting things to do. So, but I'm just going to present one angle at the moment. So I'm going to reflect on the non-separately describable character experience of movement as a way of trying to show you the kind of anti-skeptical work that looking at this topic of session can do. And then I'm going to try and spell out the consequences for non-physicalist theorizing. But I'm going to be kind of idiosyncratic in the way I'm using the term non-physicalist, so you can correct me or help me see a better way of doing it. So the general anti-skeptical move is this. If you can conceive of yourself qua experiencer as a brain in a vat, you're not a brain in a vat. That's it. But I'm not going to show you how it works. So, I think this, it does, it's really interesting. So this is the outline and it kind of basically follows a handout that I've given you. There's 5 sections, locatedness and locatedness, so just kind of sort between different locatedness and relations. I'm going to introduce a phenomenological constraint on our theorizing, and then I'm going to distinguish between continuity and connectedness to try and clarify this phenomenology. And then I'm going to detail this anti-skeptical move after this answer, and then try to start with the non-physicalist subjectives. Okay, so locative expressions are words like in, to, imply, and they pick out locatedness relations. It's interesting when you start looking at location from a philosophical perspective. Most philosophers of location are metaphysicians, and they just assume substantivalism. So, for example, Kodigama's entry in the SEP, he starts by just making substantival an assumption, and that's kind of interesting because linguists always emphasize relations between objects, so they're kind of relations, if you like, and objects like brains and vats, and then they take the translation to spatial regions to be a generalization from this more basic case. So it seems like we've got object, what I'm calling object-object in relations that we need to think about. So an object-space in relation, so the kind of relations that the metaphysician deals with. So I'm just going to introduce some idioms. So let's call the place. We're thinking about object-place distinction. So the place in the object-object in relation is going to be another object or a set of objects. Okay. So I'm going to call this an object-object-place distinction. Second case, the place is a region of space, and this is going to be, I'm going to call this an object-space-place distinction. So it's a little bit clunky, but that's the kind of distinction. But that's the terminology I'm going to work with. Okay. So first, object-object in relations. What kind of characteristics do we find objects of instantiated locations relation bearing to each other? What kind of features do we have? So the object is typically smaller than the place. So the brain is smaller than the vat, the biscuit is smaller than the biscuit tin it is in, and so on. The object is potentially mobile relative to the place. So the shape of the biscuit tin, you can hear the biscuit inside. The object is immersed or enclosed by the place so that neither are path connected, and that's a sort of slightly technical term which I'll try and spell out in a minute. And the last one, the place exercises locational control on the object. So this is another kind of bit of technical idiom that I'm going to try and introduce. I should just say that the work in pragmatics is extremely rich and really interesting, and I'm being hugely reductive, and there's a lot of pragmatic variation in when the use of locative expressions is warranted, but I'm not going to get into that. But just suffice to say that kind of the Brycean maxims always hold for use of the locative expression. So I think I've said on the handout that I want to give a characterization of when you when an object what did I say? Oh yes, when an object is unequivocally in another. So the thought that satisfies these 4 desideratas is kind of very strong requirement. Okay, so path connection. This is an idea from topology. So this is a path connected space. These 2 points are path connected because essentially, kind of intuitively, you can draw a line from one point to the other. This path through space that connects them. Okay. Right. So how does this apply in the object-object space relation? Well, the brain is not, there's no path through space that connects the brain to the vat it is in. Okay? That's the idea there. So basically, when you get a kind of something immersed or enclosed in something else, there's no path through space that connects the thing embedded to the embedding space. That's the idea. So it's just a feature of one thing being immersed in another. And then location control. So I thought I would use these images from this amazing paper, actually, by Annette Herskovitz, because I really like the typeface and also the pictures. But so the pair is in the bowl A. Here, she helpfully tells us, it's not very, let's just say, it's not normally useful to distinguish between these situations. So you can say the pair is in the bowl B, but obviously that's kind of in an attenuated sense of in. But what I'm interested in is the contrast between the case of the pair being in the bowl and if one were to say that the bread is in the bowl. Something odd about that, right? Sort of jars. And the idea is that typically something to do with the geometric profile of the container is going to make some kind of explanatory relevant difference. So the basic idea is that here, in A, the interior surface of the bowl constrains the possibilities for movement of the pair, right? Whereas here, in this case, the interior surface of the bowl isn't doing any kind of constraining work. So we might say, in this kind of idiom I'm trying to introduce, the bowl isn't exercising any kind of locational control on the bread. This is supposed to look like bread, by the way. Okay, so those were the criteria on an unequivocal object space. I'm sorry, object place distinction. So now I'm moving on to object space place. Is that okay, everybody so far? So typically the object is smaller than the place. Take it that's okay. The object is mobile relative to the place. So I always try and get an excuse to use this quote from Newton, but we don't have to be absolutists just yet. But so the parts of space are motionless. The immobility of space would be best exemplified by duration. And then he goes on to talk about days of the week. So if yesterday could change places for today and become the latter for two, it would lose its individuality and no longer be yesterday, but today. So the parts of space are individuated by their positions. They can't move, right? Bits of space can't kind of switch places, which is the picture. So the object can. The object is mobile relative to the place. Now, the object is immersed in or enclosed by the place so that neither are path connected. So I'm now path connected to the lectern. There's a path through space that connects me to the lectern. But I'm not path connected to the space I'm in. There's no path through space that connects me to the space I'm in. So one way I think it's helpful of kind of getting to grips with it is just the thought that there's no path through space that connects me to the past. Past time. Likewise, there's no, or maybe somewhat similarly, there's no path through space that connects me to the space I'm in, right? So there's a kind of reification of space as an object, and there's me, and there's no path through space that connects me to the space. And the last one is locational control. So this is sort of the hardest one to work out a kind of analogy on the same model of the pair and the bone. So here there is some work that I seem to be continuing drawing on by Graham Lerner, which I think helps us get some kind of traction on how this idea could apply to space. So here's an egg-shaped space. So things to know about it: it has variable curvature. So it's tapered here and it's wider in the middle. This is a piece of paper. So the basic idea here is if you try to move this paper into the tapered end, you have to wrinkle it to get it to fit in some respect the tapered end. If you move it kind of further into the middle, it might have to stretch in order to fit. So here's what it says. If the space is variably curved, then a thing would have to change its shape in order to move from one region to another of different curvature. it would not be freely mobile. So this would have to contract to fit here, or stretch. Contracting, stretching. Now, our experience of how things move in space suggests they are very freely mobile. So I'm not changing shape as I walk across this room. And the reason why that's the case is because our space, the space that we're in, is not, it doesn't have this kind of shape. It's a relatively constant curvature. And so here, Nerlich is drawing on Helmholtz, and particularly his proof that only in spaces of constant curvature is movement, free movement, possible. And he actually argues that free movement is a transcendental condition on the possibility of intelligibility of the axioms of geometry in this paper, but we won't talk about that. But there's a quick worry here. So if we're freely mobile in space, then space exercises no locational control. There's no locational control on me. I'm just doing whatever I want. That's not how I'm going to cast things, unsurprisingly. I'm going to say that freedom of movement is grounded in the shape of space. So in this sense, space exercises locational control of an elusive sort. Okay. So here's an early question that, I think you might ask. So could a BIVS subject conceive of or compute these object-object locatedness relations, and hence conceive of itself as a brain in a vat without being able to make or conceive of object-space relations? So maybe all it takes to conceive of yourself as a brain in a vat is being able to conceive or compute of, the object-object in relation. But I'm going to say that's not relevant because of the kind of peculiar conceit that the brain in the vat scenario is. And we conceive of objects as distinct from space places. That is, we can make the second kind of distinction. And I think our visual phenomenology concurs. Okay, so in our visual phenomenology, objects are, I claim, distinguishable from the places they occupy. So what is that phenomenology? So here I have the kind of problem that Charles had earlier. So I'm trying to excavate the phenomenology, but you might not have that phenomenology. And if you don't, that's useful data for me. Okay, so here I'm going to invoke work by Kurt Kafka, his Principles of Gestalt Psychology. Here's a scan from Durham University Library's copy of that book. So he introduces this notion that I think is helpful, and you're probably familiar with it, but maybe not under this name, georepresentation. So here, the idea is that the part of the environmental field that coincides with this figure is twice represented in visual experience. So the part which is segregated from the rest of the field in one representation, so the figure is connected with it in the ground. Okay, so you get this dual representation. So this area is twice represented. In one representation, it's connected to the ground, and the other is segregated. Is that okay? Such that the ground appears to stretch continuously behind the figure. I'm just going to call this figure ground articulation. Now, the question is, how do we get that going in 3 dimensions? Okay, so this is not Kurt Kafka, this is me. And trying to get maybe some descriptive phenomenology. If an opaque material ordinary object like a lectern is perceived to occupy space, and so the at a space place, space is apprehended as stretching behind the figure, here, such that that occluded region is experienced as present in experience and connected to and continuous with regions in full view, here for example, as well as with the space place which the opaque object occupies. So I'll just let you read that maybe a couple of times so you just see. Or I'll say a few more words about it and then I'll let you read it a couple of times. But the thought is that basically the space place that this occupies is continuous with this occluded region, as well as these regions that are in full view. It's connected and continuous with those regions. Okay, shall I go on? Yeah. So just a point of clarification, mostly for Craig actually, so you can see. So here I'm using the preposition at a space place. So here the space place is being idealized as a one-dimensional point, and that's why it seems legitimate to use at here. But the object is nevertheless experienced as in space, since the space place that it is at is connected to and continuous with other sub-regions in the space. Okay? This is an attempt at descriptive phenomenology. Okay, I'm going to try and deepen a little bit now, or explain a little bit further. So I've underlined these notions connected to and continuous with because I think we can do some explanatory work once we separate them. Okay, so A is a connected space. You can call this a space, but it's not a connected space. B is not a connected space. And we've talked about path connection. Okay, so here, space is connected if it cannot be broken up into two or more pieces. So A is connected, B is not. A path-connected space is a connected space in which a continuous path can be drawn from one point to another. We've got that. Now, when it's saying that the space place an object is apprehended as occupying is apprehended as connected with adjacent places, the assumption is that those connected spaces are also apprehended as continuous, which is to say, all of these subregions form a continuum. Okay. But notice that this is phenomenologically salient to us, right? So, you know, I want to be sure that I'm not the only one with this phenomenology, but anyway. But then we have to ask, well, how could a BIVS subject have that phenomenology? So you might think, well, how do we have that? How could we get into that sort of situation? Is there a natural history to tell about how to get into those kinds of phenomenological states that answer to that kind of phenomenological description? So John Campbell argues that empirical content can be given to the connectedness of space by movement. So he doesn't distinguish between continuity and connectedness, but he does talk about connectedness and movement. So I'm going to sort of pick up on that. So there's two forms of movement that are explanatorily relevant. I'm not going to talk about explanatory priority really here. So just in virtue of the subjects moving through space, you can give empirical significance to its connectedness, and by observing objects moving through space as well. Okay, is that all right? So here's this thought, claim. Movement is required to give empirical content to the connectedness of space. And here's the idea. Meeting Kafka's constraint, because this is a constraint on what a BIVS phenomenology is going to have to be like if it has phenomenology just like us, requires meeting this condition. That's the idea. Faster than I thought I would be. Okay, so here's the simple argument. I'll just say obviously there's problems with this, but I'm just going to put it out there. So BIVS could have experiences just like me. My experience is articulating object-space-place distinction and so register the connectedness to space. This is Kafka's constraint. So, the connectedness of space can only be given empirical significance in worlds in which movement is possible. BIVS cannot move. BIVS cannot register the connectedness of space. BIVS can't have experiences that articulate an object-space-place distinction. BIVS can't have experiences just like me. So, of course, it's question-begging argument, right? So, you know, just as you know, BIVS don't have hands. The mere fact that they don't move, that doesn't really mean anything, because what's important for the skeptic is that they can experience movement, right? So it's just a question begging argument. So what we need is a modification. Experience of movement is required to give empirical content to the connectedness of space. So the question is, can this be satisfied in the VAT? So, and here this is where I came out with an argument. No, experience of movement as we conceive of such a thing. Okay? Because after all, the skeptic is trying to toy with all our intuitions, the kind of the empirical stories we tell about how we come to have the beliefs that we have. Experience of movement is non-separately describable. So I guess some people will be familiar with this kind of idiom from Anscombe. So here's her kind of somewhat cryptic way of putting things. So when I say the sensation of, for example, giving a reflex kick is not separable, I mean that the internal description of the sensation, the description of the sensation content, is the very same as the description of the fact known. When that is so, I should deny that we can speak of observing that fact by means of the alleged sensation. Okay, so here she's talking about the non-empirical knowledge of movement. Right, so here's how I'm going to characterize her, or we're going to spell this out a little bit further. So she says, when considering the expression of the form sensation of X, for example, experience of movement, which is what we're trying to think about, we need to ask whether of X, of movement, is a description of the sensation content, or whether sensation has some other content, and X is what produces or goes along with the content. So in this case, movement would be what produces or goes along with the content. So she gives this really nice example, the sensation of going down in a lift. So that has, there's a kind of, there's what it's like to going down in a lift, right? So if we talk about the sensation of going down in a lift, that's an external description of the sensation. So we're referring to a lift and an event. But we can also give an internal description, a sudden lightness, one's stomach lurching upwards. Yeah? And the thought is, this is sort of my exegesis of it, so it might be wrong, and Anscombe and scholars out there maybe can help me, but I really think that this is more or less what's going on. The internal description, this is separable because you can give an external description, going down in a lift. So this is separable because you can give an external description of the kind of event with which a sensation like that goes along, or that kind of event produces this kind of sensation. You know, it makes sense to talk in those terms because we can separately describe the sensation and the event, and thereby sort of unite them in some kind of, if you like, causal explanation. But experience of movement isn't like this. It can't be characterized independently of movement. It's not separately describable. So think of the experience of raising your hand. I'm kind of tempted to ask everyone to do it, or in case you're feeling sleepy. This feeling is non-separately describable, I claim. It can't be characterized independently of moving. Unlike the feeling of going down in a lift, which can be characterized another way, it can be internally separately described. Okay, now the skeptic wants us to think that experience of movement is a bit like going down in a lift. That there's some kind of external, there's something external that produces this kind of feeling that can be separately described somehow. But like hand raising, this is not external to me right now. Okay. What's more, movement takes place in space, and I've been suggesting that space exercises locational control on the moving subject. If that's right, then the shape and connectedness of the space that we're in, it's relatively constant curvature, is actually explanatorily relevant to a characterization of experience of movement. Namely, I would say its continuity and its freedom, And this is non-separably describable. So this is my new direction sort of moment. So shape of space, and I missed the is explanatory relevant to phenomenology, and I think in lots of different interesting ways. There's lots of different aspects of our mentality that I think invoking the shape of space can help, maybe not illuminate, but it can add something to our explanations and our descriptions. Okay. So here's my interim conclusion, which is going to sort of make good a little bit on my claim that this is part of the broader project of producing an anti-skeptical argument, that this is an evocative expression. So in the fact, there isn't any connection between the apparent experienced in that. That's not giving empirical significance to the apparent connectedness of inverted space. Those are shots of something else. So the relation between those two cannot be empirical. It's just inexpressible. So this is a kind of really unambitious conclusion, but it's fine for the purpose of this paper. They experienced something else. This is what they experienced. And then the thought would be something like, this is not met with that, and hence plausibly nor is cognitive constraint. So I appreciate that's not very satisfying, but I just want to give you a feel for some of the kind of conceptual resources that you might have when you start looking at the logical expression and invoking features of space. So, yeah. So that's the sort of, this is the interlude, although I'm quite a bit further on in the talk than I told everything. Now I want to try and say something about whether there are any non-physicalist upshots to thinking in this way. So two cases where that's to kind of maybe help you convince you that this may be so. So I'm going to say something about these configurational aspects of conscious visual experience that I can talk about, rather than calling FG articulation, and then visual experience of empty regions. I'm not going to say much about both of these topics, but it's just to give you a sense of where different explanations might go. Okay, so I'm going to call non-reductive realism about space. So the thought that space is something over and above the material or physical entities it contains, this species of non-physicalism. So, Daniel Stolger's, is that how I say his name? His entry on physicalism in the SEP, just at the very outset, he says, you know, physicalism and materialism, also different terms, we can use it. Realism about space is kind of, if you like, sort of some typalism, is a kind of immaterialism, or if you like, not physical. That's just the way I'm going to use the term. And then reductive physicalism about space is just space is nothing more than material or physical entities and spatial relations between them. So this is physicalism. Okay. So first, I'm not actually going to say anything about this, just got one slide on it. So I've been appealing to this notion of locational control to try and motivate the thought that the shape of space and vicinity, its constant curvature, is explanatory relevant to an account of how we make an object space-place distinction. So I've been using this notion. If you're a non-reductive realist, the kind of possibilities for movement that you might invoke when you're trying to cash out what locational control involves are grounded in the shape of space. Okay, so here, the shape of this space is what grounds any kind of possibilities for movement that this object has. But in the reductive realist case, you just subtract the space, or you can keep it if you want as some kind of epistemic posit. But you just appeal to the possibilities for movement. And those aren't grounded in anything else. So that's what relationists do. And there's a recent treatment, spelling out what the geometric possibility involves, by George, I think. No. But so here, if you're a physicalist and you want to kind of, if you buy into this kind of form of explanation I've been trying to elucidate, then you're going to be in a situation where you're going to be appealing brutally to possibilities. And you might be fine with that. And lots of people are. And if you're in power, I guess if you're into kind of power ontology, that's perfectly okay. But that's just to give you a flavor of kind of the shape of how your metaphysics might go when you start to try and cash out this phenomenology. I think something like that's right. Okay. Now, visual experience of empty regions. So, back to this descriptive phenomenology I gave you. So it's going to take a material ordinary object is perceived to occupy space, and say we are a space place. Space is apprehended as stretching behind the figure, such that that occluded region is experienced as present in experience and connected to and continuous with regions in full view, as well as with the space place which the opaque object occupies. So here's the region in full view. Okay, so space that you can see me through is in your full view, because if it weren't, part of me would be included, probably. Okay, so suppose it's a datum that some of those places in full view are empty regions. Well, if you're a relationist or a physicalist in the sense that I've been using the term a reductive realist, you're going to have to endorse some kind of error theory. There are no empty regions. Okay, so suppose the error is at the level of experience. So it could come in elsewhere. It could come in at the level of the B, so you could have some kind of Kantian story. But let's just suppose it's at the level of experience. I realize Kantian story is not very descriptive, so just delete that comment. Okay. So different questions are going to arise for distinct theories of perception. If you are, I'm just assuming at this point, I'm just seeing what happens if you adopt physicalism and see what kind of, if we can kind of get to grips with these aspects of our phenomenology. So, are empty spaces phenomenally represented? Perhaps in virtue of some inscrutable phenomenal property not constructed from colour. So, Howard Robertson castigated this kind of move as bogus. It's a sort of bogus move. I think when you use that term, you're talking about depth perception, but problems. So is there some sort of, if you're a physicalist in the sense I'm stipulating, and you think that we see empty regions, then do you think that there's some sort of sui generis phenomenon, kind of mode of phenomenon representing empty space that isn't constructed from colour? That's the sort of. Well, a different kind of approach is you could appeal to structural features of perceptual experience. So not everyone might know what those are, but some people, some theorists have argued, so Matthew Steer and Louise Richardson, that you can be aware of the presence of what we call empty regions in virtue of our awareness of the boundaries of our visual field. So you're not appealing to content here, you're appealing to structural features of experience. So the idea there, in being aware of the boundaries of the visual field, you're aware of a region of space where stuff is visible. And you're aware that material would be visible if it were located within that, if it fell within those bounds. And empty regions are then experienced as regions where nothing is visible, but where something would be visible were it to fall within those bounds. That wasn't done very well, actually. But we can go over that maybe in the Q&A. But the main point is that this kind of theory invokes a subjective awareness and structural features of awareness. And so, so you've got these two different possibilities, well, there's many different possibilities, and just giving you a sense of different directions you could go. So with respect to our visual experience of empty space, reductive realism about space, in the latter case, that has to be combined with the non-reductive appeal to a property of the subject, awareness. We can't reduce the subject. Former case, it seems like we're going to have to do something like a bogus move, and it's not clear to me that it wouldn't be ad hoc. So why would putatively empty regions look whatever way this inscrutable phenomenal property has them look? So that's actually another paper in itself, so I'm not going to go into that too much, but I just want to give you a sense what happens once you decide to go with a kind of physicalist picture in the sense that I've been describing. It looks like you're going to be left with, you're going to have to impose some kinds of non-reductive. Basically, you can't be a physicalist, it seems to me, reductionist and be able to kind of theoretically capture these mental aspects that I've isolated in the school. Right, so that's more or less kind of it. I'll just give a summary of what I tried to do. So I think that focusing on this neglected letter can do some skeptical work. I've tried to argue that this Kafka's constraint can't be met in the back because this substantive key can't be actually satisfied. Tentative. Try to motivate the case for thinking that the shape of space is explanatorily relevant to explaining some aspects of ornamentality, and that's the kind of the main claim. And I just want to, I'm not hoping to have convinced you, but just to give you sort of a kind of a rough idea of where something like this could go. This view assumes not a physicalism about space, it's a realist view about space, the substantive view, and the physicalist or relationist alternative is likely to preclude reduction. So that's it.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks. Yes. Yes.